Good morning, everybody. This is Steve Kiyama with Action Coach, and we are getting ready to start SalesRICH. If I could get everybody to please share where you're coming in from. I see we have several participants already. So if you could share where you're coming in from, it'll locate your chat box panel there, and that'd be a perfectly good place to let me know. Awesome, we got somebody in from Woodbridge. That's great. Awesome, Fair Oaks. Excellent, excellent. Okay, well, let's get started. First, what I want to do is I want to share a little bit about Action Coach, and then I'll introduce myself a little bit and why we're qualified to offer a little bit about sales. We started as the world's #1 business coaching firm. We actually started up around 1993. We are operating in about 70 countries at this point. We have more than 1,000 coaching offices. This is privately owned. It's founded by Bradley Sugars, who is an entrepreneur and an author. I myself am a franchisee owner of this system. Our vision as an organization is world abundance through business re-education. Collectively, we coach over 15,000 businesses each week across the US, UK, Australia, New Zealand, and so on, which gives us an awful lot of practice and experience trying things out and using them, finding out how well they work for people. Now, I myself grew up in Rochester, New York. I have an electrical engineering degree. I actually started as an engineer. Much later, I graduated from Bucknell with an MSBA also. I have spent 20 years running small business units. So I've got a lot of practical experience, hands-on experience dealing with many of the same issues that any business owner and small business owner deals with here. For me, the corporation was like a bank. I had a boss, but he acted more like a board of directors, if you will, than a manager. My responsibility was to grow cash flow for a particular business unit. The last unit, I grew 300% in 3 years based on a business plan I provided to the board of directors, if you will. I've been a business coach, a mentor, and a trainer for over 10 years now. So I've been taking what I have learned plus what the Action Coach system brings and sharing that with people like yourselves. Now, let's get started in the pre-content. What we're going to talk about first is a little bit of mindset or perspectives, paradigms, if you will, before we get into the actual sales content. We're going to cover an awful lot of ground. It might feel a bit like a fire hose as we go. Unfortunately, with this particular media, this particular material is best offered as a live workshop. However, with this media, we will not have an opportunity for playing games and role playing and that type of thing. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the content pieces of this, and I will do my best to share that with you today. So starting with a point of power. This is a point of power. Anything below that point tends to be disempowering. Anything above that point tends to be empowering. So if you think a little bit about who do you know that lives in the world of blame, excuses, denial, what do those kinds of behaviors and mindsets bring to people? What's the result of that kind of thinking? And then flip that around and ask yourself the question, those who take ownership of the situation they're in and then take responsibility to do the things it takes to get to where they want to be, hold themselves accountable for doing those things, what do those results produce? And generally, we tend to see that those who live in the world of blame, excuses, and denial tend to be disempowered and tend to be victims, if you will. Those who tend to take ownership and responsibility for their goals, those tend to be empowered and do quite well. That's the real secret to this whole game, is choosing to be empowered by taking action to do the things that are required to be successful. In that vision, the only failure then is the failure to participate. Now, if you notice, I haven't used the word try. If we try, we have a backup plan, and the backup plan is usually what we do. If we participate, if we actually give 100%, we get back 100%. Now, a little bit about learning. To make sure you get the most out of learning, think about these two words, I know. What does that phrase do with your mind? Doesn't it tend to shut it down a little bit, tend it to stop it from learning? What we want to do is break that phrase, get it out of our vocabulary, and replace it with the phrase, isn't that interesting? So that we can focus on what it is are the things that we need to accomplish. What can we learn from somebody else? What are they doing that works that we could do as well? What can we learn from their successes or failures? If we focus on the phrase, isn't that interesting, we can make more progress more quickly. Now, what I hope to share today is a few blinding flashes of the obvious. Many of the things I'll say today, you've probably heard in some context before. What I hope to do is share it with you perhaps in a different way that you can take forward and put to practical use successfully for you. Now, we've got the chat box. What I would like you all to do is share with me a little bit about what you hope to achieve out of today. And I will do my best to accomplish that as we go along through the process. So if we could, and I'll give you a minute to do this, share in the chat box if there's any one specific or two specific things you want to achieve out of today. I will do my best to accomplish that. Yeah, think about what you want. If you're going to attend a training program, you want to be thinking about what you want to accomplish. Susie, you're quite welcome to be here. Thank you very much for joining us. Keeping consistent clients. Okay, that's good. And sell more. I'm not gonna get into the personal stuff there. I see what you're doing. Work less, gain more. We're gonna talk about how to be more effective in sales, and that's one piece of it. There is more to talk about in that context. Work less, gain more. We'll touch on aspects of it from the sales efficiency perspective. Susie, okay, you want to learn how to close more sales at the spot? Good. That's what we're going to talk about. Close more deals, be a better salesman. Okay, yep, we're going to do that. Anybody else want to share? Yeah, instead of walking away. Good point. Yeah, Susie, that was a very good one. Instead of walking away saying, I need to think about it. Yeah, that's a very good point. We're going to, as we get through towards the end of this, we're going to be talking to that point very well. How much should a salesman bring to a company compared to what he makes? Interesting question. And we weren't going to cover that in detail, but the answer to that question is he needs to bring significantly more gross profit to the company than what he makes. So I'm going to comment on that right now. And the question is, the more effective a salesman, the more gross profit he's bringing to the company. We all think in terms of sales revenue, but it's really gross profit to offset the fixed costs, including his commission. So some reason, I can see your, I've got a comment here. For some reason, I can only see my own chat. You should be able to see all of the chats. I can certainly see it. See if that helps. How to overcome a no. Yeah, that's a good question. We will talk about how to overcome a no from a different perspective. You will not overcome every no because not every person is a real prospect. And we'll talk about that fairly early, actually. Thank you for that one. Good. Got a lot of good comments here. Let's see if we can cover all of them successfully. How to bypass gatekeepers when you're cold calling. Yeah, that's a bit of a different conversation. That's one you and I should probably have on a more personal level, because it depends a lot on what kinds of gatekeepers you're running into. We weren't going to cover that one quite so much today. I'll tell you a secret to that is persistence, but you've got to have a really good message for them. And there's some other tricks that help, but that takes a little bit longer of a conversation, different from what we were going to cover today. It is an important question, though. All right. Let's talk about this from a basic fundamental basis. Every salesperson finds it a challenge to make sales. Let's start right there. Selling is not easy. It's not a given. It is a challenge. And even the professionals find that it takes work. You don't just walk in. It's not like McDonald's. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. People don't just walk in with their checkbook open if you're selling anything of significance. If you're selling pencils, that's a little bit different. But if you're selling stuff with a significant value to it, it does take a challenge. You do have to think ahead. You have to have a process in front. And what we're going to talk about is the components of that process today. The trick is to learn how. And this is a process of knowing the basics and training and training and training. So we're going to work on basics today, and we're going to get into how to train, what are the skills, and how to get through that. Let's start with what exactly is selling. So for you, what is selling? If you think selling is people just handing out money, that's probably not the right thought. Selling is really professionally helping other people buy. And this isn't really just helping them buy, it's helping them solve a problem. So what do you know about the problems that your prospects have? And what are you doing to how are you conducting yourself to helping them in a professional manner solve that problem? And we're going to talk in some detail about that. What I can tell you is the most successful professional salespeople train and train and train and train and practice and train and role play and train. It's just, it is a profession. Selling is a profession. It's not just an action. Now, let's start to think about it from a context here. And I'm going to ask you to use the chat box. What do you think? Are sales decisions based on logic or emotion? What percent do you think is logic? What percent do you think is emotion? Yeah, as you're sitting down and thinking about it, all right, we got some answers coming in. Good. Yeah, good answers. So we've got 30% logic, 70% emotion, 80% emotion, 20% logic, 20% logic, 80% emotion. Yeah, 70% emotion. Yep, 50-50. Interesting. Statistically speaking, logic is 20%, emotion is 80%. Isn't that interesting? So think about, what kind of a car do you own? Why did you buy that particular kind of car? Was it purely logic, or was there kind of a lot of emotion based into it? That I feel this or that I feel that. There can be any number of emotions that can surround that. But if you just look around at the cars on the road, how many of those cars were bought based purely on logic? And if you think about it from a logic point of view, what's a car for? Well, it's just to get you from point A to point B. So what are the logical cars that should be on the road? And yet what are the cars that actually are on the road? If you just want one simple example. A lot of cars were bought for fun. A lot of cars were bought because it makes the owner feel this or feel that. Yeah, there are a lot of inexpensive cars out there that are purely point A to point B, but that's not the overwhelming cars that are out there. And most sales decisions are made based on a feeling and then justified by the logic. So your messaging has to start with how people feel and help them justify it with the logic side of it after they've gotten to where they feel something. Part of that, there's a formula really, if you will, that helps you walk through that process. So it starts with getting their attention. What are you doing to get your prospects' attention? Follow that up with generating interest in solving a particular problem that they've got with something you offer. Then building desire. This is where the emotion comes in. Building the desire to help them choose your solution, and then giving them a path to take distinct action. Now in there you have to help them justify that desire. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit, in a few slides. But this provides you a sequence of a formula, if you will, for how your messaging can work. Now, you start with your website. If you think about it, does your website get people's attention? Does it generate interest? Does it generate desire? And then taking action in some form. Action, depending on what your product is, your action, the action you're looking for might be a phone call to you to go further. It might be, if you're selling easy to buy, inexpensive items, then they can perhaps place an order right there on the website. But if you're selling something, I think most of the people that I'm seeing on the participant list so far, most of the people are dealing with more expensive kind of items. So your action is a little bit more broken. You have to have a process where they're going to take action to call or take action to inquire for more information. So you want to think in this sequence: attention, interest, desire, and action. Now let's use that to think about the 4 different kinds of salespeople. There is a type out there that you could call an order taker. Now, if anybody's ever gone to a fast food store, by and large, the person behind the counter is technically an order taker. They sit there and they punch the buttons that process whatever order you've already walked in and determined you want. In fact, McDonald's has taken it one step further. They've put a kiosk up there so you can punch the buttons yourself. They've delegated the work of punching the buttons to the customer. But there's no real salesmanship going on in this process. Another type of salesperson could be characterized as somebody that's a product pusher. And oftentimes this is a person that's learned a little bit about the product and gotten really excited about knowing a little bit about the product. And so all they want to talk about is the product. This is not a person who's going to be really good at selling, because he's not necessarily addressing the needs of the prospect. He's talking more about himself, if you will, than he's talking about the person who's trying to buy. These kinds of people tend to offset others. Another type of salesperson is an overseller. The stereotype used car salesman promises the world just to get a sale when the value of the product that he's selling is perhaps much less. So this is a person who's just going to sell, 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 sell. Again, not really addressing the needs of the buyer. The fourth type, and this is a type you really want to try to become, is somebody who's a problem solver, who actually helps the customer find what they need. And pretty much all of the topics we're going to talk about as we go on from here revolve around this particular type of person. This is a person who's more interested in finding out what the customer's needs are, wants are, and then working to provide them. And in a manner of speaking, the answer might not be what he has to sell. The answer might be something entirely different. And this is a person who actually will send a buyer someplace else under those circumstances when it seems appropriate. Now, these are decisions that have to be made along the way. These are value decisions, but this is where the integrity really starts. So let's talk a little bit about it. Sales is about communication. But communication is a two-way process. It's communication by the seller, certainly, but it's even more communication by the buyer. So our job as a salesman is to learn very well what it is the buyer needs and wants. The results we get tell us how effective we've been. So if we are getting consistently poor results, then probably we need to relook at how we're doing our communication and retuning our communication to achieve more of what that customer really wants and is willing to pay for. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about communication for a few slides, just to provide you with some tools to help you think about what your client, how your client is listening to you. Now, I'm going to interrupt just for a question. Are you going to have access to this webinar when it's complete? Yes. There will be a recording of this. It will not be immediate. It will be in the next day or so. Now, let's go back to my modalities of communication. We're going to talk about 2 or 3 different ways people receive information so that they can act on it and do things. So the first thing to think about is many people are purely visual. 40% of the population is purely visual. 20% of the population is auditory, and 40% of the population, again, tends to be kinesthetic. Now, if we're trying to sell by email, how does that fit these modalities? Is it likely to be successful if we're selling anything of big value that's expensive? Probably if it's inexpensive, we can do it. But if it's of big value, possibly not. It might be a little bit of a big ask. As we communicate, if we're doing it over the telephone, we'll get 20% of the people who are very comfortable on the phone. In fact, I actually know somebody who will buy cars by listening to the engine over the phone. It's kind of a long story behind that, but he's more comfortable listening to people's voices than he is comfortable seeing them and seeing their eyes. On the other hand, other people, the 40%, need to see what it is that they're looking at. So hard copy or easy to see material is more helpful to them. Other people, 40% of the population, are kinesthetic. They've got to feel it. There's more to it than just seeing it or hearing about it. When I think of myself in a buying context, I'm very visual. I'm also very kinesthetic. So if somebody's calling me on the phone thinking they're going to sell me an idea, that's probably not going to be the successful path. I'm not the person. After a certain point, the words all kind of jumble together, and I'm not really going to respond well to purely an auditory presentation. I personally prefer to give live seminars because I can touch all three of these modalities. Today, we're really looking at the auditory and the visual. You're not giving the opportunity to have a kinesthetic experience. So I'm going to be successful perhaps with 60% of the population as opposed to the kinesthetic, just to give you some examples of this in real world terms. Now, 3 tools of communication that you've got: words, tone of voice, and body language. This is, again, going to be a bit of a trick when you think about selling by email. Words are only 7% of the conversation, of the communication. And this is all statistics. Tone of voice is 38% of communication. So if you're trying to sell by email or text or Instagram or even on your website, where does that fit in? That leaves 55% for body language. So what that says is if you've got a high value item, you probably need to be face-to-face. You probably need to be acting in a proactive way, and you need to be tuning both the words, the script that you use, the tone of voice that you use, and the body language that you use with that other person, so that you can get the full opportunity of communication. If you're limiting yourself to online communication, then you're kind of stuck at the low end with just the words. You've got some visual stuff that you can do with them, but you're limiting your tone of voice and body language. Now, yes, you can get a certain amount of tone of voice into words on a screen or on a page, but it's not as powerful as it is speaking with the person live, and that is certainly not as powerful as actually being in their presence. You see their body language, so you see how they're communicating back to you in real time, and they see your body language, which shows them how enthusiastic you are and care about solving their problem. There's another art in this universe that is called neuro-linguistic programming, and I'm not going to attempt to spend a lot of time on this. There are many books on this subject. It is a part of the art of this game. The neuro part is how we think. The linguistic is how well we understand the mind and how it reacts to words and tone of voice. And the programming is how we've been nurtured through our lives and how we react. Similarly, how your prospect reacts. I'm going to shorten this up. This is really worth spending some time reading about and studying. Those of us who are in sales for a long period of time, in a manner of speaking, we study this maybe informally. But the shortcut to this one is mirroring and matching, which means understanding how that person, how your prospect is comfortable communicating. If they, for example, if they speak fast, then you probably need to speak with them more quickly. If they speak slowly, then you probably are going to get a best result if you speak more slowly with that person. If they use high-level vocabulary, you probably want to also be with them in high-level vocabulary, but if they do not, you probably want to restrict yourself from using high-level vocabulary. Now, all of that said, mimicking is a bad idea. It can come across as mocking. So you want to be a little bit careful in how you do this. We're all adults here. I think we've probably had a chance to interact with enough people that we can understand what that means. So if you're trying to get a great result with more people, try to understand how they communicate and try to act in a manner in which they speak. Now I'm going to present one more aspect of this game of understanding your prospect's method of communication and reacting to it. This is actually, I think, the most powerful tool of all of these, and that is a DISC profile. A DISC is a style of so-called personality profile. You may have heard of Myers-Briggs. You may have heard of DISC. They're basically the same kind of thing. Myers-Briggs actually is a knockoff of the DISC profile. I use DISC profile with nearly all of my clients. The DISC profile is a tool designed to teach you about how you communicate, and then using that to infer how others behave and communicate. And I'm going to show you a little bit about it here in just a second. But it's a tool, and the way we use this tool is by providing a profile of you. You can then learn how you communicate, which helps you then infer how others communicate. And you can use that to tune your communication style to fit theirs. Now, this provides a little bit more depth into what the DISC profile consists of. In the basic terms, people can be divided up into roughly 4 quadrants. They are, in general, if you look vertically, they are in general either outgoing at the top or reserved, as you can see at the bottom. On the left, they are either task-oriented, or on the right, people-oriented. So those 4 dimensions give us an awful lot of information about a person, and just by seeing how they act in a context, how they speak, you can make some educated guesses about where do they fit into these 4 quadrants. And then you can make some inferences about how do they receive communication and how do they react. So if we look at the outgoing task-oriented person, who is the upper left quadrant in the red quadrant labeled D for dominance. In literal terms, this person tends to focus on results. They are very direct and they are very competitive. They walk into a party, they're looking for the other D's in the room to see who they can compete with, because that's what they will be focused on, is competing with those guys. They tend to be very short. Their communication is very quick. They make decisions relatively quickly. On the other hand, they change decisions relatively quickly. If we go clockwise from the D to the green quadrant with the I, that is the influencer. This person tends to be very friendly, very enthusiastic, very optimistic. As an outgoing person, they are very gregarious. They like people. They like to know and influence as many people as they possibly can. They also make decisions quick. They might unmake decisions very quick also. So you've got to be very, very careful with these outgoing people, that when you've made a sale, that you've really made a sale, because new information can change their minds very quickly. Going a little bit further around clockwise to the purple S, this person tends to be very steady. Their ideal scenario is to sit in a cubicle and work very quietly in a cubicle, they will get a lot of work done because they don't tend to get out and interact with other people at all. They're very sincere, they're very patient, they're very modest, and they are very slow to make a decision. They fear disharmony. They fear confrontation. So if we're pushing hard on somebody who tends to operate in this quadrant, they may not push back, they may walk away. So I have to be thinking about what's the communication style of a person. We have a person on the upper left who make a decision very quickly. On the lower right, they will make a decision very slowly. On the other hand, once the person on the right, the lower right, has made a decision, they will tend to stick with it. So these are the different aspects of communication style. Going a little bit further to the blue C, the person who operates in what we would call a compliance quadrant, they tend to be very accurate, they tend to be very cautious, they tend to be very contemplative. They study things to death. They need all of the details. They need then to validate all of the details. These guys make a decision extremely slowly, if ever. You notice my point about if ever? These are a very difficult person to sell to. Again, though, once they are persuaded, they stick with a decision, they commit themselves to a decision. So these are 4 different styles of people, and your job as a salesperson is to recognize what tends to be the dominant behavior for a given person that's a prospect, and then how do you tune your communication style to fit theirs. Now here's the art. If you're a high D and you're coming up with a prospect who is a high S, you are the one that has to learn how to communicate successfully with a high S to be able to sell successfully to that person. If you're a high I and you've got a prospect who is a high C, then you have to learn how to adapt your behavior. You have to calm down, and you have to be willing to deal with a lot of detail to help that C get comfortable and trust you, and then learn to buy from you. So these are one of the arts of sales, is studying these communication styles in depth so that you can most successfully communicate with most people. Now, nobody is, I won't say nobody is, most people are combinations of things. So it's never, it's not often going to be crystal clear which one of these people they are. Somebody could be a DI or an ID. Somebody could be an IS or an SI, where they tend to be dominant, people-oriented or task-oriented and have combinations of these pieces in them. But this is getting a little bit more refined, and this is what I mean about studying the communication styles. The more you study people's communication styles, the more effective you can be in helping them discover that the product you've got provides what they need to solve the problem that they have. Now, going from there, we're going to start getting into processes. Now, every great salesperson has a very carefully thought through purpose. I remember we talked a lot about the styles of salesperson. The successful salespeople focus on the needs of the prospect before they focus on the product. What they're looking for is, how can I help this prospect solve his problem most effectively? And then how does my product help them accomplish that? So the product becomes secondary, not primary. And I want to just kind of reflect back on those different types of salespeople we talked about a few minutes ago. The product pusher and the overseller, for example, tend to be stereotypical salesmen. These are the kinds of people you'll see on TV. This is the kinds of people you'll see caricatured in advertisements. There's actually a couple of ads out there right now doing a pretty good characterization of those kinds of people. But they're not the kinds of people that are successful in sales for long periods of time. The people who focus on prospect problems to solve and make the prospect better off are the ones who are most successful in sales long term. And if you want to test that, start to measure your conversion rates using different styles and see how they come out. Now, that gets us to what's the best and most powerful tools a successful salesperson can employ. And that is simply questions. Questions are the biggest tool, other than the art of understanding people's communication styles. The next most powerful question is questions. Now, there's often a joke out there, we've got 2 ears and 1 mouth, use them proportionately. Yes, listen twice as often as you speak. And in fact, the more you focus on questions and listening, the more effective you will become at selling. It's not about pitching, it's about listening. Now, I'm going to show a questioning process for a concept here. Basically, you ask a question, and by the way, the person asking the questions actually is the one in control of the conversation. You are in the position of directing the direction of the whole conversation. The more questions you ask, the more control you have. So you ask a question, they provide an answer. Hopefully you're asking an open-ended question so that they provide an in-depth answer. And then follow that up with another question and answer with the purpose of digging deeper, trying to understand, and it's a 2-part understanding. You need to understand what they have. Maybe they haven't thought it through and they need to understand it in more depth. And so you are helping them understand their problem. And you keep going with this until you've gotten deep enough that you've drawn out enough emotion on their part that they ask you a question. Now, this is often a buying question. And you provide an answer that helps them get to that sale. Now, sales comes in steps. That might not be the order. That might be a step towards the order. But in a way, what you're accomplishing is steps to a place where they own in their mind your solution, at which point then you're ready to do a transaction. Now, this is a lot different from an old style of selling. An old style of selling was focused on a formula of generating rapport, pitch, 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 and follow up, follow up, follow up, follow up, follow up. And this can last forever without making any sales. It's a lot of activity, and it's not always successful. Will you make some sales? Yes, you will make some sales because some people are in deep need and they've got to act, but you're not making the same numbers of sales and the same volume of sales that you would if you follow a different kind of formula. And going back to the rapport, there's some old jokes about that. In some big companies, there are purchasing agents, and purchasing agents will put up pictures of family or pictures of things that purportedly they've done just to see what salesperson will fall for them as a tool of gaining some rapport, when in fact those pictures had absolutely nothing to do with his own family or his own activities. So you want to be a little bit gentle. Yes, you want to build rapport, but you want to build rapport that's real rapport, not rapport that's superficial rapport. People see through it. A more effective process is something I would refer to as a question funnel. And guys, yes, these are slides that were built by Action Coach, but I can tell you over the 20 years that I worked in running business units, I was a salesman in that entire time. These are exactly the processes I had to learn how to do the hard way. And sometimes it generated millions of dollars of business if I did it carefully and thoughtfully. So this particular question funnel starts with open-ended questions. And we'll talk about open-ended questions in just a second. As we start with the open-ended questions and we get answers appropriate to the open-ended questions, we can start drilling more specifically, more deeply into the kinds of problem that the prospect wants to solve. As we get specific enough, then it becomes a time that we can offer one or two solutions. I kind of like personally the 2-solution process, or even 3 sometimes, because that allows us to generate a range of ideas without putting the person putting the prospect in a spot that he feels pressured to make a purchasing decision, because he may not be ready for a purchasing decision quite yet, but allows you to ask a temperature question. And we'll talk about temperature questions in more detail in a couple of slides, but allows us to take in a way a temperature. How do those solutions fit what he had in mind? If we've listened carefully and successfully matched solutions against how he perceives his needs, then we're going to get positive answers. If we have not, by following this process this way, we don't necessarily get a no, end of conversation. We get an opportunity to go back to the open-ended questions or the more specific questions that allows us to drill down more effectively towards the answer that particular kind of person is looking for. So no is not no completely. It's no, not yet. It's no, we haven't found the right solution, or I haven't felt right about that solution yet. And the conversation can continue. So somebody asked a little bit, how can I avoid the no? Well, the no is often, how do I present my solutions as opposed to the solution itself? So if I can work at it with degrees of a solution and then take a temperature, if the temperature isn't right, I can go back and ask more questions. Once we get to an answer that gets specific to what they're looking for, now we can start to talk about more detail in that specific kind of way. So the detail might be how a project would be conducted. It might be how does the program work. It might be the mechanics of how this process works and getting closer to what a price might look like in this particular kind of context. Now, I said I would talk about open-ended questions. We've all heard from our school what are open-ended questions: who, what, where, when, why, and how. These are the kinds of questions you want to be asking right from the beginning. I'm going to warn you to be a little bit gentle with the why questions and the when questions, because those can bring prospects back to when they were in school or when they had parents, and those had a tendency to be accusatory questions, or were used as accusatory questions. But they can be reformulated into a kind of question that it still asks why and when, but it's phrased a lot differently. So why could be, what is it about that? And then whatever the details are can be a why question. How long do you think, or at what point, or how soon could be used to substitute for a when question? You're still going at the when concept, but you're presenting it in a manner that's a lot less accusatory and more to the point of what they're trying to get to. In this entire process, your job is to play dumb and dig deep. Now, what does that mean? Play dumb. assume nothing. Okay, assume your name, but assume nothing, because the more you assume, the more opportunities you have to present the wrong solution. What might appear true to you in your life may not appear true to your prospect in his or her life. So truly play dumb, assume nothing, dig as deep as you can, get them telling you what they need you to sell to them. In other words, let them do the selling, not you. Now, mechanics of that questioning process. There are ways you can introduce questions that help soften the question to a much more pleasant conversational process. And this is an awful lot of skills here. Anybody who's ever watched Columbo has heard these questions. He was just awesome as to how he presented these questions. Can I just ask? Oh, by the way, incidentally, these are awesome ways to introduce concepts and questions in a way that it helps the prospect not feel interrogated, but in a pleasant conversation, a non-confrontational. Remember, we talked about the S people. They don't like confrontation. And I say that, the D people love it. They just eat that stuff up. It's a game for them. So you got to tune how you use these questions and who you're using them with. But these are tools that you can use in your process. Never simply take an order. Ask questions. You're going to find out that the more you just try to be an order taker, the more likely it is that that sale could come undone. You've heard of buyer's remorse. That's an easy way to get into it. You want to focus on asking questions, and then after every question, focus on listening and supporting them in a very nurturing kind of way with positive strokes. If you've got kids, use the skills that you use with selling your kids on an idea. Use the same ideas. How do you get them to like and trust you? Well, you provide them with nurturing strokes as opposed to just moving on with it. Don't use your high D, use your S to help people feel good about their problem and that you can solve it for them. Okay, now we're going to get deeper into the mechanics, and this is going to get to a couple of the questions that were asked. Sales can tend to be a process. If there's a sale involving a large amount of dollars in particular, it may be a complicated process requiring multiple connections, multiple conversations as you go through the entire process. In my particular case, we like to have about 13 different steps, of which 6 or 7 involve communication with the prospect. And each of those, well, several of those involve either phone calls or meetings. You want to introduce each meeting with a script tuned for your particular business. At the very beginning of the meeting, you want to ask permission to have a conversation in a particular way. We'll talk about that particular way here in just a second. Part of that permission asking process should include a question about what do they want to get out of this communication as well, so that both of you have a clear understanding of what each other wants. Ask permission to ask a lot of questions, to follow a particular process and ask a lot of questions, because you need to understand what it is they're dealing with. At the end of a series of questions, you will provide them with a solution or a couple of solutions for them to decide on, and then ask permission for them to agree to making a decision. Now, not necessarily a yes decision, it could be a no decision. Treat both as equally valuable, a yes or a no, because that allows you to move on immediately. This maybe stuff doesn't, it leaves everybody in limbo. So discuss at the very beginning that there will be a decision at the end of this conversation. Now, the decision might not necessarily be to buy a product. It might be a decision to go to the next step. So if your sales process involves, let's say it involves 3 different conversations along the way, that each one will end with a decision whether or not to move on to the next one. If you get a no, then you can scratch this prospect off and move on to the next prospect. I'll give you a little clue. The confidence of a given salesperson is strictly proportional to the depth of their pipeline. So if you've got 14 or 15 prospects, any one prospect is not absolutely critical to your sales goals. Think about that for a minute. If you've got a good depth of leads, then you can feel confident that some of those leads will buy in accordance with this process. Some will not, because your product, your solution, does not necessarily meet their perception of their need, unless you've done a really good job of asking the questions earlier. Okay? Now, this all gets to how good are your questions? What questions do you have at each step? How effective are they in helping that person discover, because this is what it is, they have to discover and own the concept that your solution is the one that they need. And then you can very cleanly ask them at the end to make a decision, yes or no. At that point, you will ask them for an investment, and you guys will set a date for taking action. And then again, ask permission at the end of this little script to go through that kind of process. In this way, there's no surprises. They don't feel surprised because they know exactly what path you're going to follow. You won't be surprised because you'll know exactly how they feel about each of these different components. That way, it's total clarity. There's no mystery about what's going to happen next. There's no mystery about what we're going to accomplish in this meeting. Now, we may come to a decision to not proceed. That's okay. That's when we move on to our next prospect, and they move on to their other, whatever vendor they want to talk to next, if they are really serious about solving the problem. This is where you might find out they're not really serious about solving the problem as well. Now, there is a bit of a process in how you ask these questions. And we're going to do 2 slides on this particular concept. You're going to ask a question. You're going to listen very, very carefully. You're going to give them a positive stroke, that just you nurturing stroke. You empathize with their situation, and then you're going to ask them another question. This means you need to have a list of common questions that help you probe deeply into their kinds of situation. This means you need to understand your prospects in general, and then specifically this prospect. As you're doing that, you're going to be asking a question. You're going to play dumb in how you ask this question. You're going to let them discover their emotion about that issue. This is your biggest tool to a successful sales interaction, is helping them find the emotion around their particular problem that allows you to present a solution that they want, they need. You're the one that cares the most. Of all of the people they're talking to, all of the vendors they're talking to, you're the one that cares the most about their particular situation. And you're just going to keep going. If you recall that question, answer graphic I showed a little bit ago, you're going to do this until they reach a point they say, how soon can we start? That's an emotion that they are ready to go. Now, as you're asking questions, you can frame questions in a way that allows you to give out little bits of information. But you're going to, if you recall, we talked about the modalities of communication all the way back in the beginning of this presentation. Do your best to talk in their language. Now, I don't mean Spanish, I don't mean Korean, I don't mean Japanese, I don't mean any other, I don't mean those languages, but speak in the kinds of terms that they are. If they are visual, you need to speak in terms of visual parameters. If they are auditory, you need to speak in auditory terms. An example of that, a person who tends to use the phrase "I see" is a visual person, or dominantly a visual person. A person who speaks in phrases as "I hear you" tends to be an auditory person. Or a person who says "I feel what you're talking about," that tends to be a kinesthetic person. That's what I mean by talking in the caller's language. Speak in a manner in which they can identify and feel comfortable with you, because that's really what's going on here. They need to be comfortable enough with you that they can learn how to trust you. And the whole purpose of the questioning process was to help them learn to trust you and your kinds of solutions. People only buy from people they like and trust. And if you're speaking in a manner that seems foreign to them, then they will not like you, and therefore they will not learn to trust you. The real core of this is learning to think in terms of the question, what's in it for me? That's really what's going on here, is they are thinking, what's in this for me? And you have to put yourself into their shoes with this entire process to think about, what do they need? What do they want? Why do they want it? And how do I present it to them in a way where they see the value for themselves emotionally first, and then they can justify it in a logical term, so that they can justify to themselves and their conscience that you're providing an effective solution at a good price. Now, questions you need to pick up along the way, and some of these questions should be asked early in your process. For example, who other than yourself will be involved in making this decision? This is a really important question. Do you want your prospect to tell you at the end of hours of conversation that they've got to go compare notes with their spouse, or their advisor this, or their advisor that? Or do you want to find that out at the very beginning so that you can be talking to all of the advisors at the same time, so that when they're at the point where a decision has to be made, that all of the advisors have the full story? Or are you going to allow yourself to be in a position where they've got a bunch of information, some of which they'll remember, that they've got to then go off and sell to their advisor or their other decision makers? Think about it from the point of view, who do you want to have making the decision, them or a spouse who's not there? And think about that and plan your process accordingly. You probably want to have all people in the sales meeting together if you can possibly do that. If you can't do that, you're going to have to work on how can you help them have all of the information that's needed for making the appropriate decision. And even then, the risks start to go high that you wasted your time. You really want to have everybody there. Another question that you want to be talking about is the budget. A good phrase Obviously, finances are very important. Can I ask what budget you've set aside for this purchase? This is a kind of question that should be, again, very early in the process. You need to know the parameters that you're working with. Are you going to be presenting a solution that fits in their budget? If you're not, why bother making a presentation? In a manner of speaking, if their budget is half of what it's going to take you to solve it, this is probably not a good prospect. Why are you spending a lot of your time working with them if they're not qualified to buy your product? Now, you might be able to have a conversation also is, where's that money, if it's a big purchase, where's that money coming from? What's the source of their financing? We could talk about mortgages and loans and all those other kinds of things. That's all possible. Is that something they're able and willing to do? Is that part of their comfort zone, if you will, about buying your kind of product? So you want to get these on the table very early. Now, very rarely will people disclose an exact budget, but you might get them to be able to say it's between this and that. And that gives you a lot more information to discover, is this actually a qualified prospect, or is this not a qualified prospect? Now, then you can get all the way to the end and they can decide that, no, this is not the way they want to go. That's still true, but at least you've narrowed it down. Are they qualified to be able to buy from you? If they're not qualified, why are you spending time with them? Or at least large amounts of time. You might point them and refer them to somebody else who can offer a different kind of solution that does fit within their budget. Then you are being a problem solver. And you are building credibility in that process. People will be likely to refer you to people that they know that can afford your kind of solution. Now, after you've reached an emotional stage and gathered all the information, we can start thinking about some kind of closure process. So one way to approach this is, based on what you've told me, either this or that will suit you best. And I use the word will. I want you to be confident in what you're doing. Based on what you've told me. Now, this is in a manner of speaking, a temperature checking kind of question. This doesn't put them in a box yet where they have to say yes or no. This kind of a question allows them to come back to you and say, well, no, neither one of those does. And okay, now we can re-enter the questioning conversation and get into, how do we better understand their problem, better understand what kinds of solutions that they're looking for that'll get them to where they want to be. This gets us, I mentioned the temperature checking process. That was a temperature checking process. Others, how does that fit with what you had in mind? Which one fits best with what you had in mind? These are different ways to say the same thing. Assume you're going to make a sale. Your job is to find the solution they are going to buy. Now, this is assuming we've qualified them, but we assume the sale so that they have comfort that you have confidence. Now we're getting to a close. The phrase I like to use is, based on what you've told me, we'd be crazy not to go ahead, wouldn't we? Well, if we've asked all the questions, we've discovered solutions that fit all of their criteria, then we would be crazy to not go ahead, wouldn't we? Now, you can phrase it in your words, but this is basically a way of getting them to a place where they know they've got to make a decision, yes or no. Now, overcoming objections. If we've done a good job early on in the process, there shouldn't be objections along the way or at the end. If we've done a good job qualifying them for money, you should already know. And it might have been a qualification process. This was not a qualified person because their budget isn't sufficient. So you really want to focus on your questioning process and your delivery process on preempting key objections. These are two key objections I've seen people struggle with. Think about, and in fact, make a list. Here's an action item for each of you. Make a list of all of the common objections you get from prospects. All of them. Put them on a board someplace. And then start to go through them and boil them down. What are they really? Because I'll bet there's 5, no more than 5, and it may be a lot less than 5, that are really the core objections that you run into. When you run into those core objections, then sit down and analyze how and when should I have preempted those objections in my questioning process, helping the prospect discover that your solution does not meet their objection criteria. Now, the two common ones that I have seen people run into is no money and no time. This particular phrase here, as using value-based content to show how employing your product or service will make a larger profit, kind of presupposes we're talking in a business-to-business context. If we're talking to a consumer, we have to do it in a little bit different way, but it still gets down to the value of what you're offering meets their budget. Remember, we asked the budget question early on. It meets their budget and provides the value that they were looking for in the first place. In fact, it probably needs to demonstrate it provides more value than whatever the competitor is offering, not necessarily at a lower price, but at a higher value. And that's where you want to be focused, is how do we present value? And no time, that means they haven't really owned the solution in a way. They haven't owned the idea that they have to reprioritize their use of time in order to adapt to whatever the solution is that you're presenting to them. So now we're getting down to, have we successfully gotten to an emotion of priority? If you're getting a no time objection frequently, you're probably not digging into their emotions of priority deeply enough. That kind of gets to how serious are they about solving this particular problem. And those are the kinds of questions that you can preempt in how you're presenting your solution. Now, I've had a question here. My biggest challenge is people want my services at the least cost. Yes, that's what they say because that's what they can measure. Always will be true. However, your job is to put them in a place where your cost, whatever your price is the right price for them. Now, we get into some cultural things. This tends to be a very international place. We get into some cultural things, and some people build their pride about how they got a discount from this person or that person, how they got that person to lower their price. And that kind of invites you to raise your price so that you can lower it, doesn't it? I'm just asking. Another place you can go with this is re-looking at how you qualified the prospect in the first place. How effectively did you sit down and say, this is a prospect I really want to invest my time in? Because that's what you're doing. You're investing your time in a person. Is this a person who is actually qualified to spend the amount of money that it takes to buy what you buy? Now, not every supplier is the same. In fact, none of you are the same. So if you're supplying widget A, all of the kinds of people that supply widgets that are similar to A or services that are similar to A are different. What makes you unique? What makes your delivery of your process special? And this is something I work with clients a lot. And this is sometimes a very difficult concept. Pencils are pencils, and yellow pencils and red pencils are exactly the same except for the red and yellow. So who are the people that need red pencils and who are the people that need yellow pencils, and how do we differentiate those in the beginning? If your differentiation is good, then you are the only vendor selling that differentiated product or service, and therefore there is no other vendor out there with a cost that's lower than yours. Now, you can get yourself into a place where you're lowering your cost and lowering your cost and lowering your cost and lowering your cost to the point you're out of business. Selling on low cost will drive you out of business because you can't afford to keep going. A salesman's job is to get the highest gross profit that can be obtained from the market. Now, collectively, the most gross profit as well. You have to think in terms of what makes you uniquely successful to solve their particular situation, their particular problem, so that they can buy from you at the price you're charging. Don't keep lowering your price. A sequence you can go through in this is to get agreement that you understand that they have an issue. They lack some information or they have an objection. Ask if there's any other reason besides that they would not go ahead and buy from you. Because you want to know what are all of the objections before you deal with any of them. You might find out they've got 5 or 6 objections, but there's only one that matters, and it's probably the last one they'll share. If they give you another objection, then you can ask, if you fix that, would you be okay to go ahead? And if no, there must be another objection. And then you ask, what is it? If yes, spend some time looking at their objection. It might be that you can't lower your price because. Now, this is where we get down to what was how valid was their budget. Move on to the agreement at that point. I mean, let's think about that. If yes, they're ready to go. Really? They've told you what their objection is. Your job is to answer that objection. That takes you back to the questioning process, really. Go back to the questioning process. What is it that we did not understand? What did we not learn in the questioning process? Did they forget to share something with us? This is an opportunity to really dig in deeper into their emotional need for this particular product. At a certain point, they're going to be ready to go on to the agreement. This is where you're going to be able to get into the details of what the process is for your product, purchasing your solution. What are the steps we need to go through? What's the paperwork? That kind of stuff. You can add, there's a couple of questions that we've got here that can provide you with some ideas. How would your business normally pay? That's kind of a business to business kind of situation. Would you prefer to implement at my office here? These are the standard kinds of questions that can come up at that stage when we're ready to move on to an agreement. Would it be okay if I outlined what we need to do to get that underway? This is another kind of closing, detailed question that gets them along the process of making all of the decisions that have to be made. A very powerful tool is silence. Columbo used this phrase. It's been powerful ever since. Just the question, it's and be quiet. Let them fill in the silence. They will tell you more at that moment because that puts them under pressure. You need to be silent. Now, this is all about being professional. You're going to want to develop a sales kit. Depending on what your industry is, you're going to want to dress well. For those of us in professions, a blue suit has statistically shown to be, with a red tie, by the way, has statistically shown to be very successful. Always be on time, always be a bit early, in fact. Keep in touch. Pre-frame your prospects, and pre-frame is really where we step up right at the beginning and understand early on what they're looking for and what their limitations are. Do your homework in advance. Keep testimonials closely available. Always keep them on your website, every place you can have them. Keep testimonials. Build rapport right from the beginning, and rapport. You need to be in rapport all the way through this process. The most effort needs to be spent on finding out what's most important to your prospect. If money is most important to your prospect, what's their budget? What are they going to spend? What are they going to be willing and able to spend? Always follow up, always send thank you cards, always ask for referrals, and follow a process that always is consistent. Now, that is the extent of the content that I'm going to provide today. We've been in this for quite a while. I'm going to make an offer because you're here today. My offer is to take an action step towards your best possible business results. So I'm going to offer one free 2-hour coaching session to help you convert this general information to your specific business. It'll be face-to-face here in my office. My contact information's on the slide. You probably already have it. But this is my easy to get contact information. Feel free to, I'm going to put the action on you. If you want to take this action, send me an email or make a phone call, and we'll set a date and time for it. Now, questions. You've got some actions based on some of the things I said. You know some things you need to do. Do you need me to review anything? And do you have any questions? So let's take about 2 or 3 or 4 minutes to give people an opportunity to ask questions. So I want to do my best to end on time. I question everything. I like that. Yeah, it's hard to present an answer for that particular question, but I'd be more than happy to sit down and chat and go through the slides and chat with you if you'd like. Just send me an email and we'll pick a time. Any other questions? That was a lot of material in a big hurry. To be perfectly honest, I like presenting that kind of material over a longer period, but for a webinar, that seems unrealistic. What is the value of no? Clarify what that question means, please. You're very welcome, Lisa. You're very welcome. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Oh, why do I want to get to know? I see. Okay. Good. That actually is a great question. The value of no is so that you can cleanly move on to the next prospect. You don't want to spend any more time than necessary on if you're a salesperson, your job is to get sales. Your job is not to force a particular person to buy. Your job is to get sales. So just move on to the next one and not think about the past one. That's the value of no, is you don't have to waste any more time on that particular question. Now, another piece of that is keep statistics. Keep your conversion rates, and if you can, categorize your conversion rates, because that gives you a tool then, and here's the other piece of no, that gives you a tool to calculate and to evaluate how well you're going through your process. Where did you lose it? Where did you lose that particular prospect? When does no mean yes? I think it'd be better if you and I sat down and chatted, because I think you've got some good questions we should spend some time on. Susie, what would be a buying signal? Yeah, a good buying signal is how soon can we start? What kind of statement should I get to get closing of sale at the table? How soon can I start is a great question for your particular business. And in fact, that's probably the most important buying question that you might look for is how soon can we start? Or something of that nature. Any other questions? Thank you. Thank you very much. You're very welcome. All right, guys, that should be about it for now. I will go back if you want my contact information. That's it right there. Get in touch with me. We can sit down and chat, have a cup of coffee, and go through what details you want to get into. And I hope you all have a great day. Thanks very much. And with that, we're going to close off.